Alright, welcome back to the show. Today we are talking about NBA legends and were they actually good or not? Were Bill Russell and Wilt Chamberlain the greatest players to ever play the game? I say no. I'm saying the best players to ever play the game are playing the game right now, and I'm going to make my case for that statement. First of all, the talent pool is way larger. There is significantly more international interest in the game of basketball. In 2009, there were a record-breaking 83 international players in the league, which was considered pretty outstanding at the time. Now there are 120 international players and they come from 40 different countries around the world. Also, I can confidently say, without anyone getting upset with me, that the best player in the league is international. Whether you believe it's Luka, Embiid, Jokic, or Giannis, it ain't an American. Basketball is now estimated to have the third most fans around the world next to soccer and cricket. Another reason the talent pool has increased is because there's a lot of money to be made in basketball now. 20 years ago, the basketball-related income for the NBA was $2.6 billion. Now it's $11 billion, and half that money goes to the players. With NBA salaries getting larger and larger and the amount of positions to play, the amount of jobs to be had in the NBA remains the same, the level of commitment and desire to get better at the game is increasing, forcing the players to become even more skilled. After the first collective bargaining agreement, which gave the players revenue share, there was an explosion in 7-footed players playing in the league. Why would this be? Why would there suddenly be a ton of 7-foot players? Did people grow overnight? No, it's because there's a ton of money to be made if you have that kind of height advantage. This was back when your best player was your tallest player. You'd throw the ball down into Wilt Chamberlain or Bill Russell, or if you're really old, George Mikan. And you'd hope your tallest guy was taller than the other team's tallest guy. There are players like Manute Bol, George Murasan, and Mark Eaton who got into the game late in life, kinda in adulthood, because they saw it as a professional opportunity. They had this advantage, they might as well take it. Now consider a guy like Taco Fall. He's 7'5" and he can't even stay in the league. He's playing in China. No disrespect to Taco. It's hard to be in the NBA. He's only played 40 games as an NBA player. Or Boban, who's 7'4" and has never averaged more than 13 minutes per game. There's loads of 7-footers every year who don't get drafted. That's because being tall is a nice to have, while being a highly skilled basketball player is a necessity now. Another reason is players' careers are getting longer, thus giving these players more experience and more time to perfect their craft. I hate it when people say craft, unless you're building furniture. While the average career length is still 4.5 years, and it has been since the 70s, the reason careers end is not because players are getting injured, but it's because players are getting outskilled by other players coming into the league. Back in the 70s and 80s, I'm sure players tore ligaments all the time and just rested until they felt like they could get back on the court. The MRI machine wasn't even invented until the 70s and wasn't even available until the 80s. Players just came back at whatever level they could play at until it wasn't an NBA level anymore. Now hundreds of players have undergone ACL, MCL, and meniscus surgeries and have come back at the same level or possibly better. As a matter of fact, Al Harrington came back from his MCL surgery and played 82 games the following season and played 30 minutes per game. Al even played 11 seasons after his knee surgery. This wouldn't have been possible in previous years. So advancements in medical technology is one of the reasons NBA players are able to extend their careers and get better at the game and improve the players around them. The next reason is young players are getting exposed to basketball way earlier. Basketball is becoming prominent all around the world, and there is way more money, not just in the NBA, but in basketball in general. Every high school has a basketball team. Every kid goes to a basketball camp in the summer, and during the off season, every kid plays in an AAU team or in some other league. There are thousands of people who have a job in basketball and they aren't a coach and they aren't a player. So like most other popular sports, there is actually an economy around the game. Richard Jefferson even mentioned that he knew parents that were signing up their kids for travel basketball at the age of 7. So for better or for worse, kids are starting their careers in basketball very, very early. And the main reason NBA players are better now than they used to be is they're able to learn from the past. They're able to learn from players before them. Players are now able to break down plays watching tape. Players and coaches can watch one single play over and over again, so they can recognize patterns and know instinctively what the next chess move is. Kobe Bryant was one of the greatest defensive players of all time, not only because of his intensity, but because he would watch his opponent's games and figure out what their offensive style was and what plays they ran. Kobe looked at the game and tried to figure out how it worked. He saw it as a clock or a watch, and he'd watch the mechanics and how teams would work together, and he would break it down and reverse engineer it.
The way film was broken down, it was broken down to the smallest detail. It was broken down to the right angle. It was broken down to foot placement, timing, looking at the posture of a teammate. You know, what could he be thinking? What could he be feeling? Same thing with the opposition. You know, you watch the feed, watch players go into the timeouts, who's talking to who's not talking. You start looking at every little thing. And so watching the game for me would take like 5 hours.
Kobe went from watching plays to see what went wrong and what went right to actually imagining different scenarios if they played out if a player had done something differently. Having so much basketball from the past eliminates mistakes from the future, creating a smoother, more enjoyable basketball game to play and watch. To play, I assume. The rules of the game have changed in recent years as well. Backcourt violations are now 8 seconds instead of 10 seconds. And the shot clock is reset to 14 seconds as opposed to a full 24 seconds. Both of these rule changes increase the pace of possessions, not necessarily the game though. Because pace on NBA.com, if you look at the actual metric, is measuring how many possessions each team has during a game. In that case, the fastest era of basketball was the 80s. Teams were running and gunning all the time, probably a result of Magic Johnson and the Showtime Lakers. But the possessions themselves are moving significantly faster now. Now let's talk about how players are taking the hardest shot in the game way more seriously. When the three-point line was introduced in 1979, people looked at it as a gimmick or a trick shot. You'd probably see 2 or 3 a game and you'd be lucky if you saw one go in. Now there's an average of 35 three-pointer shot a game and 13 of them usually go in. Before this era of basketball, a pull-up three-pointer off a dribble was not a thing anyone would do. If a player dribbled and created space for himself, jumped and shot the ball from the three-point line with a hand in his face, it would make headline news. It would be the top of SportsCenter for a while. Now that's most of the plays in the NBA. The step-back three-pointer is one of the most common moves. Even young children have added the step-back to their games. Similarly to when I was a kid, we would add and one Nike mixtape type bullshit to our game like this. All I'm saying is that the level of skill it takes to be an NBA player has increased over the last 30 years. The amount of effort it would take for an average Joe to play in the NBA doesn't exist. I believe most people, regardless of how much time and how much effort they put into their basketball skills, can't make the NBA. I believe you have to be born with some sort of genetic advantage. Sorry, kids. Obviously, you're gonna have haters on both sides saying legends are better than the guys playing now and guys playing now are better than the legends. Some people say that MJ would be DeMar DeRozan if he played in the league now. That is not true. Here's why. Maybe offensively you could make that argument, but Michael Jordan was a DPOY and was first team all defense 9 times. DeMar DeRozan is a good player, but he was never any of those things. He was not a defensive player and is still not a defensive player. But everyone likes to have an opinion, everyone likes to speak their mind, even if the thoughts aren't their own. Let's talk about Charles Oakley and what he said about Giannis Antetokounmpo. He criticizes him for taking those big Euro steps, says he'd get his head knocked off in the 80s. Charles Oakley is a real tough guy. I think a lot of old heads miss the days of the NBA bruiser. They miss when you could body check a guy at the rim. I think they're also a little bit salty that the guys in the league are making significantly more money than they did when they were in the league. They love to talk about how you could push a guy going up for a dunk and not get a flagrant foul. Personally, I don't really miss that. It looks very dangerous if you look at old highlights of the NBA. Now, rim protectors actually have to be skilled and follow the ball to the basket and get a clean block. Also, the hand check rule started to be enforced in 2004. This meant bad defenders were completely exposed. If your lateral movement wasn't quick enough, you weren't able to just put your hand on a guy and ride his momentum to stay in position. Listen, you can't compare different eras of basketball. One thing you can say though is that the game of basketball is evolving, and the amount of skill it takes now to play in the league is significantly more than it was in the 80s and 90s. That's how I feel. Obviously, this is really subjective. It's not like objective or whatever, but when I watch old highlights, also old highlights, they're always in slow motion. If you watch, it makes the game look like it's very slow paced, but they're always in slow motion. I think they do that to show you that it's old. I'm not sure why, but either way, even if you speed them up, they're not as good. They're not as good. The defense isn't as locked in. The offense isn't as impressive. So be good to your mothers. Eat your corn dogs.